So I'll just give you a quick brief, and I'll answer whatever questions I can answer, and we'll ask for comments or anything the chief can fill us in about EMS and all that. Around 12:51 today, we received a 911 call of an active shooter at the high school. Deputies immediately responded, and we received over 100 911 calls into our dispatch center, over 100. The deputies took a suspect into custody within 5 minutes of the original 911 call. They recovered a handgun from the suspect. The suspect fired multiple shots. There's multiple victims. It's unfortunate I have to report that we have 3 deceased victims right now who are all believed to be students. We have 6 others that were shot. One was a school teacher. They're all at local hospitals being treated for various injuries. Yes, it's a 15-year-old student who was a sophomore at the high school.
The standard that schools have to use is basically set first and foremost by the Constitution. So it starts off with the Fourth Amendment, which means that citizens are free from, overly intrusive search and seizure. So that sort of sets the foundation that any search, whether it's in a school or outside of a school, has to be considered legal under the law. So that's sort of the starting point. But schools have a different standard inside their building or on school property than, say, police officers would have during a criminal investigation. So as far as a school, whereas in a criminal investigation, there's normally the standard of probable cause that you have to meet before you can conduct a search or a seizure of someone. In schools, it's basically reasonable suspicion. So you just have to suspect that it's likely that a crime was being committed, as opposed to believing, the higher standard of probable cause. Probable cause is pretty much almost like there's a 50% likelihood of a crime, being committed, versus reasonable suspicion is more like 42%. So it's a lower standard, and schools throughout the nation have that discretion, if they can establish reasonable suspicion, to then conduct a search of a student's phone, property, search the student themselves, their backpack, anything like that. This doesn't apply to school property like a school locker or a desk or whatever. Schools have a lot more discretion in those cases. I want us to take a look at is, if you're able to, can we pull up the slides from that's going to begin with Ethan's note or Ethan's drawing that was into, because when we take a look at that, it will sort of show an example of the type of information that the school had days before the shooting ever occurred. So it's a good beginning point. This is a copy of the image that was reportedly entered into evidence in Ethan Crumley's case, where this image was seen by a teacher prior to the shooting, like the day before the shooting, I believe, approximately. In this, you see there's quotes show that it's a phrase that was written on the page. Like, so anything in quotes is a phrase that was written on the page, and I kind of put it in quotes because it's saying that it's his words, versus if it's a drawing, it won't be in quotes. So like the first one on the upper left says image of a gun. This image we're looking at, according to reporting, is different than what the teacher initially saw. What the teacher saw and took a photo of with her phone didn't have any of these scratch outs. So for example, where it says image of a gun, where you see that on the upper left, up image of a gun, that's scratched out, but that was a drawing of a gun, and prosecutors looked closely and could tell that it had been a gun that was like then penciled out later, right?
Okay.
Then if you go to the next line below, the thoughts won't stop. That's in quote. That's him saying the thoughts won't stop. The next line below, help me. He crossed out help me. By the time police and prosecutors found this in his bag, he had already scratched some of this out, but it wasn't scratched out when the teacher initially saw it and reported it to the parents. The next line.
Now, did the teacher report it to the parent or to the school?
My understanding now, it probably was reported to both, but I believe the parent, among their actions, I'm sure they reported it to the school, because then there was a subsequent meeting,
Gotcha.
right?
Gotcha. Okay.
But the well, let me back up. The first thing that was reported to the school is that there was him searching the internet on ammunition, okay, on school property, and that was reported to the school. And there's a text thread that went back and forth between or from Ethan's mother to him, where she said, "I'm not mad at you." I'm paraphrasing, but I'm not mad at you. Just next time, don't get caught. So prior to this note being observed, Ethan was observed by school personnel researching ammunition. Okay. So, and the school notified the parent, and I'm sure administrators knew about as well. I would presume the teacher would have informed like a dean or someone else as well. Okay. So then following that, a teacher the next day, I believe, but in the timeline, the teacher then sees this drawing where it's an image of a gun. The thoughts won't stop. Quote, help me. Quote, my life is useless. If you look on the right side, quote, there was a phrase that scratched out that says blood everywhere. The phrase blood everywhere was written. Then the next thing is on that upper right is the drawing of a bullet. Okay. Then where it says body in a pool of blood, Ethan had reportedly drawn a body like it was laying on the ground in a pool of blood. Then the next line you see, it says the world is dead. Quote, the world is dead. So when a school has information that a student has been researching, because this gets into the question of responsibility from a school district, right? As a former school officer, I've worked at suburban high school that had several thousand students, as well as a suburban middle school that had over 1,000 students on 2 different occasions. So I've worked in buildings with thousands of staff and students, and I've encountered numerous situations like this where a student was suspected of being having a dangerous weapon or something that could harm students or staff or harm themselves. And in that case, when you've got evidence, like in this case at Oxford High School, where on 2 different occasions you have something associating this student with firearm ammunition. On one instance, he's researching it on school property, which is against, I'm sure, their code of conduct and would be a violation and would be a red flag already. Then on top of it, he now is found by a teacher having where he's drawing bullets, and he's got a draw, or he's drawing a bullet, he's drawing a pool of blood, a body in blood, he's drawing a picture of a gun, he's drawing all these things about the thoughts won't stop, help me, my life is useless, or what have you. Prior to the interview of Ethan, as I understand it from the timeline that's been provided by numerous news outlets, prior to that interview with the school and Ethan and the parents, the school had this information. On top of it, there's the subsequent conversation or admission by the school administrator that when he picked up Ethan's bag, it was extremely, like, unusually heavy. And he made the comment to say, wow, what do you have in that bag? When he handed it back, not knowing at the time that it was filled with ammunition and a firearm. At that point, it's very, in my opinion, in my professional experience, it would have been well within their rights to conduct a search of that bag on the information that they had, because they don't have a standard that rises to the level of a law enforcement probable cause. They didn't have to have evidence that a crime was committed. They had to have the possibility to believe that it is reasonable to think that it's likely a crime was committed. And that's a completely different standard. So for example, if you look at the next slide here, can you see that on your,
Yeah.
on your view? Okay. So this is open source information as far as the network, the Network for Public Health Law in Michigan. Okay. So there's an interesting quote here. This is published in January of 22. In November of 2021 is when this shooting took place after Thanksgiving. Okay. So maybe 2 months later, right when COVID is beginning, this publication points out Michigan school districts' legal authority and responsibility to protect students from COVID-19. It just gave that as an example. Okay. But if you look at the quote, the first part, the beginning says, in Michigan, school districts and local health departments have separate and distinct, though overlapping, legal authority to protect students within their jurisdiction. Okay. Now they're talking about COVID-19, but they're just saying, but before we get into what they're protecting them from, they're saying that they've got the authority to protect their students, right?
Okay.
So look at the next slide. Michigan Public, and this is like just from the summary of this. Michigan public schools have independent legal authority and responsibility, key phrase responsibility, to protect student safety, health, and welfare. Students that fail to, excuse me, schools that fail to provide a safe environment for students to learn may face liability. So, one of the things that this points out is that under Michigan law, it is understood within school districts that there is both the authority and responsibility to keep students, and then I would say keep staff safe as well within a school building. So, based on the information that was available, because I'm aware in Illinois, for example, where I'm from, of numerous school shootings that were thwarted by the process of what I'm describing to you, where there was not necessarily that someone saw a gun, but that there was evidence of a gun, that there was evidence that there's a possibility if someone was looking into ammunition and these other sorts of things. And by good communication and proactive work on the part of the school and law enforcement, numerous school shootings have been averted. So in this instance, you have a case where, unfortunately, there was evidence that Ethan was fascinated with ammunition. There's evidence that he was drawing pictures of ammunition and guns and bodies and crying out for help. The school had that information apparently prior to the interview that they had, in which the parents didn't disclose, that he had access to a firearm, and he was allowed to leave that room without um, his bag being searched. And the last thing I want to say about that one point is this: is that at most, had they searched his bag and found the weapon, at most criminally, that case, maybe they wouldn't have been able to charge him for it, or he wouldn't have been convicted, or they would have said it was a bad search because they didn't have enough evidence or what have you. That's a different conversation than the loss of life, and I want to extend, mine, and I'm sure your, condolences for the four children and the families of the four children who were killed, as well as the other students and staff, that were injured during that tragedy. And it just seems like it's an obvious case where the school missed something that was staring right. Answer for that is that most of the law, and while I'm speaking in terms of Illinois law, it's all based on federal law, and it's all based on the Constitution. That people can only be charged with a crime if they do something knowingly and willingly. So, for example, I know we say involuntary manslaughter. Well, that doesn't sound like it was voluntary. So, what do you mean? But the actions that were taken by the parents were intentionally designed to be deceptive, right? They had material information, specifically the fact that the husband had purchased a firearm, a 1 week prior or the weekend prior, that both the mother and the son had posted photos of him with the firearm, bragging about buying the gun, and the fact that there was a gun, the fact that there was bragging about having access to a gun, the fact that there was prior mental health history. These were all things from, as I understand it, is the way that the case has been described publicly, that these were all things that the parents intentionally withheld from the school district. They didn't disclose that we have access to a firearm in our house. Our son has previously had, hallucinations where he saw ghosts or other images that were in the house, allegedly, that he has this history of mental illness that we're working through. They didn't disclose any of that. I mean, look at the sidebar communication with the text about next, I'm not mad at you, just don't get caught, when her son was researching ammunition, right? And the school was concerned about it. So I think that's what creates a space of heavier burden, heavier responsibility. As a parent that your child has these things going on. And when you're in a meeting where the school is saying that they are concerned about school safety and the possibility of what, the school's trying to interpret, what does this mean? What does this drawing mean? Why was he researching ammunition? Why were these things happening? The parents had information that could have brought everything clear in that moment. They could have said, first and foremost, Ethan, is there a gun? And do you have that gun with you? We have a gun at home. We need to confirm where it is. You don't have it with you, son, do you? Okay.
Got it. Okay.
Take the bag from them, search the bag. They could have done all that. Instead, they didn't, and they withheld it. And it significantly contributed to this tragedy. I'm not going to say it caused it, but it helped facilitate it. So that's where they have a greater responsibility, in my opinion. School definitely had the authority. That's another point, is that even if the school didn't feel that they had the authority to search his bag,
Mhm.
they certainly had the authority, and I argue they did have the authority to search his bag, and I would say that from personal, professional experience, having been
Okay.
in situations that are similar to this. But in addition, they definitely had the power to send him home. There was nothing um, about the circumstances that didn't, at least at a minimum, suggest that he was dealing with some sort of emotional crisis, mental health crisis, needed assistance. I mean, look at the note again with the things that we pointed out in terms of the language he was using, and which he then later went back and tried to say all the opposite. Oh, it's a great day, just joking, or just a video game, what have you. So anybody looking at that would say, okay, wait a minute. I'm looking at the picture that the teacher said, and you said all these things. Now, the next day when I look at it, you've scratched all that out and everything is fine and everything is okay. We're concerned, and based on our concern, we're going to send you home. We're going to search your locker. We're going to search anything that you would have had access to. We are going to insist that your parents take you to see a mental health professional to have some sort of assessment that at least an independent person can deem you to be safe to return to school. I have seen schools do that on numerous occasions, under the umbrella of student safety, and staff safety. And so it's like the school did neither. They didn't search his bag and they didn't send him home. And so that's again why I feel like they were irresponsible in terms of how they handled that portion of it. Certainly, it was even exacerbated by the fact that the parents could have given any one of those number of pieces of information we talked about, and the school would have been able to go, okay, yes, we're going to have to search the bag. We're going to have to do this and that.
Could
But
have
they could have
raised
sent
it
him
to
home.
another level of concern.
Right. They could have sent him home. So why they didn't send him home and didn't search the bag, I mean, really, I can't make sense out of that. It just seems, kind of unthinkable that both of those things happen. Having worked in both uh, Chicago school environments as a teacher, and then also in suburban environments as both a teacher and a police officer, that sometimes it's a level of like the hardened security that's happening on the front end, because metal detectors, let's be specific, right? Like metal detectors in the process of students being searched early in the morning. That's pretty commonplace in many urban, public school settings. But in suburban settings, it's frowned upon in many of them. So, for example, in Illinois, that's been my experience, is that quite often in the suburbs, there's not the metal detectors. There's not the kind of more firm searching of students as they make their way into the building, because the optics look bad. It's perceived as, oh, well, this must be, an unsafe school or unsafe environment, as opposed to saying like, this is an environment where we want to ensure student safety, and staff safety. So we're going to put these measures in. So I think some of it is really as simple as that. Not that metal detectors in public schools catch everything. They certainly don't. There's a million ways to bring a weapon into a school that's not through the front door or in a backpack. But there are many cases where students in city schools are found to be in possession of weapons just through their normal searching and metal detector procedures that in suburbs often don't exist. What it sets precedence for is a level of accountability. If a parent willingly withholds material information that could help to reduce the chances of a tragedy of this level. I think that if a parent knowingly is withholding material information that could help an investigation determine that there is the possibility of a mass killing, school shooting incident or otherwise, that I do believe that parent faces the possibility now of this like landmark decision being the litmus test. And there's several, like the uh, the father. I'm sure he's quite nervous. I'm sure his legal team is quite nervous. Similar case we had here in Illinois, the Highland Park mass killing on the 4th of July, where the father is facing trial for having signed off for his son to get a firearms owner identification card, because he was not old enough to be able to have one without a sponsor. The dad sponsored him reportedly, despite the fact that the son in that instance had allegedly threatened to kill the family, and there was other evidence that he was a dangerous person, and yet the father still signed off on his ability to be able to get a firearm. He then went out and bought an assault rifle and then, committed mass murder on the 4th of July here in Illinois about 2 summers ago. So that case is pending trial as well. I'm sure both of those are instances where someone is going to be able to argue, prosecutors are going to be able to set the stage and say, here are parents who knowingly had children or young adults with mental health histories of mental health problems, mental illness that was either being undertreated, undermanaged, and still created a situation where their child was able to have access to a firearm, and both of those turned into mass killings. So I think in terms of that type of precedence, I think it definitely is going to hold more parents accountable if they know that their children are in crisis and they're knowingly still helping them get access to weapons. They can expect to be held more accountable under this ruling. Well, let's go back to the Crumley case for a minute. From my understanding, that was a 9mm handgun that he
Okay.
used in that case. So it wasn't an assault rifle. It was a medium caliber firearm, sidearm, what we would call, that he could conceal easily in his backpack. And he went out and committed, mass murder with that. So I think that even if you took the gun out of the equation, if there was someone whose child was fascinated with knives, sometimes we see mass killing incidents or mass killing attacks that happen overseas where they don't have as much access to guns. And so it'll be like a public stabbing of multiple people with knives or swords or what have you. You hear about those a lot, like in certain Asian countries and even in Europe.
Okay.
Even if you had a child who was fascinated with knives and they were already always doing things with knives, and there was evidence that they had a mental health problem, they were dealing with something where they were behaving unsafely, and then the school thinks they see something too, right? In this instance, like, your son was looking up pictures of people being stabbed, and we're really concerned about that. If the parent knew that their son had access to a set of knives that he was fascinated with and had a history of mental health problems and didn't disclose the fact of those pieces of information, I think prosecutors could argue in that case that the parent was also being irresponsible, because here it is. Here's the bottom line. You have information that your child is potentially posing a threat to themselves or someone else. And when you have that information as a parent, you have to act on it, just like any other mandated reporter, any other person who's responsible in society for other people's well-being. You can't keep that. You have that. So I think the hunting versus the assault rifle versus the handgun get into sort of just maybe the scale of how many people could be harmed or killed in a given period of time, but it doesn't change the parent's responsibility to inform the school or authorities if their child is posing a threat to others. It's indicative of the fact, or kind of just really illustrates the fact, that parents have to be honest, and it's beyond parents, but let's just say, since we're talking about parents, that
Okay.
parents have to be honest about their child's mental health and the child's need for, on the path to mental wellness, if there's obstacles that are in the way, if there's things that the child is experiencing that makes it less likely that the child is balanced, that they're, whether it's hallucinations or delusions or extreme anxiety or depression or whatever, let alone conduct disorder and other behaviors that get more indicative of them being, say, violent. Because obviously, most people who have mental health challenges are not violent, they're not unsafe, they're not a threat to anyone, and they simply need assistance. But parents who are experiencing, who see that their child needs help, it just further illustrates the fact that they've got to make sure that they're getting help for the child or asking for help for the child, especially as it relates to the school, because the home and school, those worlds blend into each other all of the time. The average student in school, in public school, spends more time at school than they do with the parent on a given weekday. I mean, there's been statistics that show that for years. So it really behooves the parent to be communicating well with the school. The bigger issue is society has to work much harder to destigmatize mental health problems, because that's part of the problem, is that parents are often afraid that the child is going to be judged, that the child is going to miss out on access to a fair and proper education, and free education. They feel that their child is going to be stigmatized, or that their family is going to be stigmatized, and maybe they've had negative experiences in the past where, when they've tried to come forward with, you know, whether it was their own mental health challenges or that of their child, when they made that public or made that known, maybe they experienced some kind of backlash or something that made them kind of shy about disclosing in the future. So I think that we need to do a better job as a society of creating the space where people can be honest about the mental health challenges that their children are facing and give them the support that they need so that they realize it's not a punitive situation, it's a support situation, and it's a resource situation. I'm sure the Crumleys, if they could go back in time, would have much rather said our child is, we think he, has experienced, mental health crises in the past, or he has challenges or so forth, and that they did the search, found the weapon, and got him the help that he needed, as opposed to this tragic outcome. I have no doubt that they would go back in time and change it if they could. Parents who experience child-to-parent violence and abuse are often in the home with a child who's in a mental health crisis. Now, there's different degrees of that, and there are cases, of course, where children are abusing their parents, and you can't really point to one diagnosis or one reason other than the child is engaging in abusive conduct because they're choosing to. But I think it really speaks to the fact that we've got to help parents who have children in these abusive situations to come forward, even if it's from the beginning because they don't, they're very afraid of their child being, arrested, the child being removed from the home, the child being removed from their lives. I mean, that's sometimes the big concern. But we've got to encourage them to come forward to at least say, listen, if there's a mental health component to this in particular, it's a starting place, right? We can't assume that the child is going to get healthier on their own, like any other kind of health problem. Often, most times, people who are experiencing a mental health crisis, especially if one's leading to violence, it's not going to fix itself. So we have to help the parents to say, you have to come forward, talk to the school or talk to your family, somebody who they trust as a starting point to get that child some help. And then we can figure out, the police aspects, and we can figure out the court aspects, and we can figure out other things that the parent might be nervous about. But if they don't get that child who's exhibiting this behavior, the help that they need, it could cost them their life. And I think that that's how serious it is. And we have to reiterate, or it can cost the life of someone else. Because in this case, Ethan Crumley didn't kill his parents. He went out and killed classmates and wounded a teacher. So the problems don't go away. They either explode at home, or in many cases, they'll come out into the world and they can explode. And while most cases of child-to-parent violence and abuse don't end in homicide and they don't end in matricide, there are millions of people around the world who are experiencing ongoing chronic abuse because they don't know where to turn when it comes to getting their child assistance or when it comes to getting themselves the protection that they deserve.
Thank you so much for taking your time. Is there anything you want to share? Anything that's new that you're doing?
We're working hard on two different books on the
Okay.
topic of child-to-parent violence and abuse. One that centers around my experience working with the Mack family. Sheila Von Weiss Mack obviously was tragically murdered by her daughter Heather Mack. So I've got one book that I'm working on that topic, and then I'm working on another one that is focused on not just the Mack family, but several families that I've worked with and designed to bring more awareness to the topic of child-to-parent violence and abuse here in America, because they've modeled it pretty well overseas in terms of public awareness, laws that help to provide more support and services, and that's something that we need to do a better job here in America. So working on those, and a couple other projects that are kind of early in the process, but definitely busy trying to help families and staying busy.